Hello everyone, and welcome to the second day of Risk and Regulations Live 2024. This is our penultimate webinar event, and in it we're going to be looking at the National Planning Policy Framework. We've got a great panel for you today, which includes Pamela Chesterman, who is a partner at Irwin Mitchell. We've got Charlotte Watson, a senior policy advisor at the Royal Institute of British Architects, and we are hoping to be joined by Chris Webber, who is Barratt's Group Planning Manager. He's currently having some technical difficulties, but he's going to be speaking last, so hopefully we'll get those resolved in time for you to hear from him. Hopefully our panel will be able to help unravel some of the complexities of the new framework, which will be the cornerstone of planning decisions across the UK for years to come. Make sure to send any questions through if you have them, as it'll help us get the most out of our panel. If you want to watch the session again afterwards, it will be available on demand via the same link. It should be available from about an hour after we finish. So to start us off, Pamela is going to give us an overview of some of the sort of environmental regulatory issues in the NPPF. If other panelists could remember to mute their mics while Pamela's speaking, that would be great. Otherwise, take it away.
Thank you. I'll just... Oh. The first hurdle is making sure you can see the slides. So I think I'm there.
Can see the first one, so I think that's okay.
Perfect. Oh, sorry, I've moved it on, I think. Great. So sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. For those who don't know me, I am Pamela Chesterman. I'm a partner in the Planning and Environment team at Irwin Mitchell, as Daniel mentioned. So we'll dive straight in. I'm talking about the biodiversity net gain elements mentioned in the NPPF, but introduced by the Environment Act in 2021, with its primary aim to leave the site in a better environmental condition than before development. This has become mandatory for major developments since the 12th of February 2024. So all new applications seeking permission for major developments will now be required to improve the biodiversity of a site by a minimum of 10%. The current position, as of March 2024, is that major developments will have a mandatory 10% obligation imposed by way of a planning condition. Central government had delayed the implementation of this for several months, but during that time, several local authorities have included the 10% minimum in their local policies, requiring improvement through biodiversity. Since the Environment Act in 2021, there has been several subordinate legislative instruments. The bottom one on that slide, Schedule 7, which was introduced by the Biodiversity Gain Consequential Amendment Regulations to the Town and Country Planning Act, provides the statutory framework that we're all working towards now with the BNG requirements. The commencement number 8 regulations at the top of that slide introduced BNG commencement dates for new major applications and set out several transitional arrangements. The exemptions regulations prescribe exemptions for the requirement of 10% BNG, and I'll go through that in another slide shortly. The modifications and amendments regulations require the submission of a biodiversity gain plan for phased development, which will be really important for a lot of listeners, I think, from here on. And the irreplaceable habitats regulations, by no surprise, sets out modifications dealing with irreplaceable habitat, and I'll mention that briefly in another slide. In terms of what not yet been commenced is the requirement in relation to smaller sites, but that is expected to take effect currently the 2nd of April, so not long at all. Nationally significant infrastructure projects are expected to trigger the requirement from November 2025. And I've set out on that slide some other of the types of planning permissions that don't currently trigger the requirement for BNG. Just to note, the final one on that slide, planning in principle, although the PIP doesn't trigger a requirement for BNG. The subsequent technical details approval will trigger BNG requirements, so it's important to keep that in mind. As well as legislation, and the purpose of this presentation, this is all firmly based in national policy, which is contained to the main within the NPPF. I've set out on that slide paragraph 8, and you can see very squarely the environmental objective specifically mentions the requirement to protect and enhance natural, built and historic environment, which includes specifically biodiversity. Paragraph 11 goes into the local planning authority's responsibility when setting out its planning policies, but also making its decisions. So as we know, there is a presumption in favour of sustainable development, and part of that sustainability appraisal is the consideration of improvement to environment, as we can see in paragraph A. Footnote 7 that went along with that last paragraph deals with irreplaceable sites, and you can see there's some of what's been considered to be irreplaceable habitat sites. So we're talking about triple SIs, green belt, local green space, national parks and heritage coasts along with others. Paragraph 186 again specifies what local planning authorities should be applying in terms of consideration of biodiversity net gain and environmental considerations. Specifically in paragraph A, you can see there, if significant harm cannot be avoided, the suggestion is the planning permission should be refused. So in terms of practical requirements, it is advised through the DEFRA calculation and on the website to engage an ecologist at the earliest stage. The metric is available on DEFRA's website, and it is, to be fair, quite comprehensive but quite complicated, considering whether or not there are habitats deserving of protection or capable of being improved on site. As we're quite familiar with other schemes and other obligations and policy compliance, there is a hierarchy of delivering improvements that mirrors what we're already used to. So as you can see on the slide, the first is always on site. The second, in the event you can't provide it or any on site, is off site. And the third is credits. So there is an opportunity to buy credits, but this is highly de-incentivized with the requirement to go with one or two at its base. In terms of securing the obligations, as mentioned, there is now a pre-commencement condition that will be deemed implemented on all applications granted from the 12th of February. Conservation covenants are also in the making. They will be agreements between landowners and responsible bodies. Just a caveat on that responsible bodies do have to be registered, and that's also set out in the regulations and in the normal way planning obligations. So we've seen section 106s, which are agreements between the landowner and the LPA, being used to secure the delivery and ongoing maintenance of biodiversity gain schemes. In terms of phased development, there is now a requirement for biodiversity gain plans to be submitted to the LPA, and these must be applied for in advance of any development, and the LPA has an 8-week consideration period to determine these things. In the event they refuse it, you are entitled to appeal in the usual manner to the Planning Inspectorate. As mentioned, there are several exemptions at the moment, and these are set out on the slide and more particularly detailed in the regulations. Just touching briefly then upon the habitats and nutrients and water neutrality that's also mentioned within the NPPF and its own regulation. This is, as much as it looks like a restriction, a real opportunity for developers, particularly in terms of greenbelt land that might not be the most obvious for bringing forward for development, especially in terms of local planning authority positivity. So the first one on that slide we've seen is greenbelt, and there's a potential to even look at increased land value, where that greenbelt land might be capable of providing natural capital and creating habitat banks. There's an opportunity to diversify land holdings for landowners, particularly where development schemes have not really been forthcoming or favourable by local authorities. And it's just a couple on the bottom bit. Previously, it wasn't sure whether we could bundle or stack, effectively have a duality of uses for biodiversity net gain and nutrient neutralities. And the suggestion at the moment and guidance is that that is appropriate in some cases, but it is always advisable to get ecological advice before bringing these forwards. But there is also an opportunity to potentially offset future development activities. The next slide just briefly shows the areas that are currently affected by nutrient neutrality advice. And to be fair, it is mainly down south, although we have had alerts from clients in those areas of shortage of water for their residents, which is something that Natural England and DEFRA are suggesting might become something much more relevant up north. So just a couple of slides in terms of what development is caught. It is predominantly residential. The case law was all stemmed from house builders. So we're seeing mainly mitigation being sought for residential schemes and care homes or hotels, which are effectively a derivation from that. So in terms of just how to approach the nitrate issues, step 1, consider whether the development site is in an affected area. Step 2, calculate the site's nutrient budget in a similar way to the BNG would be calculated in units. And step 3, consider the solutions in the same sort of way as we did before, understanding that always the preference is for on-site solutions. The next slide just similarly sets that out, reflecting the same sort of hierarchy through obligations and planning permissions. And as before, in the event that there isn't anything you can do on-site or off-site, there is a credit scheme, but again, it's highly desensitised to enable schemes to bring forward their own policy compliance on-site ideally. But just in conclusion, it's always best to consider these issues early and design it out if possible. The guidance and the legislation clearly envisages that being a practical solution. So that's me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pamela. Keep your questions coming in. We'll have a Q&A section at the end, so that'll be the opportunity for the panel to answer those questions you've got. Next up, we've got Charlotte from REBA, who is going to give us an overview of the MPPF from a policy perspective.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm just going to share my screen. If you could just let me know if it works, that would be amazing. Is that all set up?
Looks good to me.
Perfect. So yeah, thank you guys. Thank you for inviting me to join this discussion here today on something that is such a vital topic of conversation at the moment. To introduce myself, I am Senior Policy Advisor for Housing and Planning at the Royal Institute of British Architects, or REBA. We are the leading professional institute and membership body for architects with over 50,000 members worldwide. We are also a registered charity with a royal charter, working to deliver better buildings and practices, stronger communities, and a sustainable environment. At a time where there is a significant shift in national planning policy, planning reform is a really vital topic. Both the reforms to the MPPF and the passing of the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act last year are once-in-a-generation opportunities. We must use them to ensure the environment is fit for purpose, not only now, but for well into the future. Michael Gove, the Secretary of State for Levelling Up, has been really clear on the principles underpinning his proposed changes to the planning system, which are beauty, infrastructure, democracy, the environment, and neighbourhood, what he calls the Biden principles. But what impact do these have in practice when applied to the revised MPPF? So I'm going to focus on 3 key areas today, which are meeting housing need, balancing character and density, and the green belt. So I'll start with meeting housing need. So the scale and complexity of the housing crisis is significant. And at REBA, we're really clear that this means we need to build high quality, sustainable homes at pace. In theory, the government agrees with this, aiming to build 1 million homes over the course of this parliament. But do the changes to the MPPF look likely to help it meet its goal? So one of the most controversial changes is the removal of the requirement for local authorities with up-to-date local plans to demonstrate a deliverable 5-year housing land supply. Instead, if they're at an advanced stage of plan making and have proposed allocations to meet housing need in place, they will only need to demonstrate a 4-year housing land supply for a 2-year period. And while high-performing local authorities might be breathing a sigh of relief at this change, it doesn't come without some sanctions attached. So for local authorities who don't produce up-to-date local plans, requirements will be introduced for annual updates to housing land supply. And for those who still fail to produce plans, the presumption in favour of sustainable development will be enacted. So we think there are some welcome measures here. The reforms are looking to meet housing need in a plan-led way, which is something that we at REBA have been suggesting for a long time. Adherence to local plans, taking a strategic approach to housing delivery, and rewarding forward planning are all moves to be welcomed. However, any moves to weaken the need to demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply are, for us, a cause for concern. If we want to take steps to increase housing supply across the country, why would we be rewarding high levels of delivery now by paving the way for less delivery down the line? Surely this equates to storing up supply issues for the future. Moving on to the second point, which is balancing character and density. We know that issues of beauty and character are real areas of interest for the Secretary of State, Michael Gove, so it's no surprise that this has come through really strongly in the reforms. Firstly, there are now references to creating well-designed and beautiful places. And changes in the text of the NPPF confirm that significant uplifts in the average density of residential development may be inappropriate if out of character with the existing area. Where this applies, it must be evidenced through the use of design codes. This emphasis on best practice in design is to be applauded, but we know that beauty is subjective, and we're concerned that attempts to bring forward necessary high-quality development will suffer as a result of this change. Can we really be sure that questions of beauty and character won't be used to reject planning applications which would otherwise be approved? With many planning authorities lacking qualified design expertise, these reforms may have a noticeably detrimental impact on housing delivery. And this is the thorny question that we need to ask here, which is, how do we balance this emphasis on character and density with meeting necessary targets for housing delivery? And in short, it looks like urban centres are likely to bear the brunt of added density. Revised wording clarifies that the urban uplift to the standard method for housing delivery should be accommodated in cities and urban centres rather than in surrounding areas as well. And not only does this feed into the focus on what's described as appropriate density, but means new housing will likely benefit from existing infrastructure and amenities. And we agree. It's sensible to concentrate an uplift in density where there is existing infrastructure. But does this mean that it should be done wholly at the expense of accommodating delivery elsewhere? We need new homes delivered up and down the country, but we know there are some really big barriers to making this a reality. Policy making isn't done in a vacuum, and there are always wider, sometimes political considerations at play. And I'm going to bring up what's quite often the elephant in the room, which is greenbelt development. So there's some changes in wording in the revised NPPF, which confirm that there is no requirement for greenbelt boundaries to be reviewed or changed when plans are being prepared or updated. But this appears to contradict the emphasis on meeting housing need elsewhere in the NPPF. However, this is not a substantive policy change as much as a clarification of the existing position. And this clarification being included is potentially one of the most politically charged elements of the ongoing reforms. Emphasising the protection offered to the Greenbelt while promoting density in urban centres was likely a decision influenced by the upcoming general election. And from a policy perspective, some of these changes feel quite characterised by contradiction. Moves to increase housing delivery are coupled with caveats around location and character, which will likely serve to prevent much needed development in some cases. We can't stand still on delivering the homes and places that we need. And in short, the changes I've just spoken on will have a significant impact on planning policy, and in doing that, on the way we shape our built environment more widely. But policy is only one part of the puzzle, and the other is implementation. Even the highest standards of national planning policy will struggle to cut through and have a positive impact if the skills and capacity to implement it aren't there. We know that planning departments have experienced one of the most severe cuts in terms of real terms budget allocation in recent years. And not only does this impact capacity, but it also hinders the recruitment and retention of qualified design professionals, including architects. We urgently need to see comprehensive resource injected into local authorities. And we also think that we need to see a more holistic approach. So less contradiction, no more piecemeal improvement, and no more trade-offs. We need commitment to strategy, proactivity, and collaboration with experts from across the breadth of the sector. By sharing knowledge and expertise, we can ensure that that best practice is placed front and centre, and it's only through harnessing this approach that we can collectively get the results that we need to see. Thank you. I'm going to try and stop sharing this now. Sorry. There we go.
Thanks for that, Charlotte. Reminder to keep those questions coming. I think now we're going to hear from Chris Webber, who hopefully his microphone is now working. Are you with us, Chris?
Yes, I think so.
Perfect. So Chris is going to paint us a picture of the day-to-day implications of the new NPPF on the ground. Take it away, Chris.
Right, just got to try and figure out how to share my PowerPoint. 2 seconds. Doesn't seem to want me to share my PowerPoint. Is one of you able to share it for me? Apologies. Is that up on the screen?
I think we're struggling to get that up at the moment. Perhaps you could
Yeah, well, I'll start talking around it anyway.
Describing, and we can see if we can get it up while you're talking.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, apologies everyone for the tech issues. It's been a bit of a nightmare trying to get today to work, but hopefully nonetheless you still get a good feel for what I'm trying to get across today, which really is that developer perspective. So my name is Chris Webber. I'm Group Planning Manager at Barratt Developments. Barratt are the largest and best known house builder in the UK. We've delivered over 500,000 homes since our inception. And we are really at the forefront, and our teams are at the forefront of much as the kind of name of this webinar suggests, decoding the implications of the new NPF. What does it mean for teams? What does it mean for our applications? So I have very much tackled this part of the presentation from an operational perspective. What am I seeing? What are my teams seeing on the ground? And I've kind of categorized these impacts, these implications in 4 main areas. One of which is the increase in protections to neighbourhood plans from 3 to 5 years. And I've sort of looked at it from, okay, what is the NPPF change? What is the short-term impact that we're seeing? And then actually, is it as bad as it seems at first glance? Is that impact going to be felt in the medium and the longer term? So taking the first change that I've picked out, which is the neighbourhood planning, 3 to 5 year increase in neighbourhood plan protection. So I think we're going to see what's the short-term impact of that. yes, neighbourhood plans immediately get a lot more protection and a lot greater standing, really, in the decision-making process by having their sort of protection time increased. So there's an immediate impact in terms of applications that are in play. But also, I think we're going to see almost a swathe of new neighbourhood plans envisaged as communities seek to take advantage of the opportunity that's now in front of them. We also have, brilliant, on screen. So just on the second. Excellent. Thanks very much, Celine. My second page is the greenbelt boundaries that Charlotte touched on. Actually, what we're seeing on the ground are these delays, restarts, local plans, local authorities trying to essentially, from a developer perspective, take advantage of these new policies that are in play. So we have to look at, and I'll reference it on the right-hand side, Mole Valley, authorities that were maybe proposing greenbelt release, now seeking to backtrack and take them out on the basis that they think they don't have to do it. We then have the removal of the 5-year housing land supply argument. And whilst there's no impact on applications submitted pre-19th of December, because there's transitional arrangements in place, that is going to see reduced short-term speculative opportunities. There hasn't been a lot of plans published and adopted in recent years, but there is still a considerable number that are deemed as up to date. So applications that have gone in post issue of the framework are going to see a much more difficult, a much stricter environment for bringing forward those sort of speculative applications. And then lastly, the introduction of the 4-year housing land supply as well, which only comes into play if that local authority has a Reg 18 plan or a local plan at Reg 18 or a later stage in play at the time of determination. And what's interesting, and I'll tackle it in my next page, is there were no transitional arrangements built in for that. So what we've actually seen, and it was most highly publicised in Wiltshire, I believe, applications that had been approved on the basis of a 5-year housing land supply deficit, maybe sitting at 4.5 years or so, actually being recalled back to committee because they'd only got a resolution to grant, they hadn't actually got the consent, which has been a massive impact to us. And I know quite a number of other applications and sites as well. And I think not particularly, or hopefully what DLUC intended when they brought that forward. But actually, are all of those as bad as they seem? So you look at neighbourhood plans, yes, their protection is increased, but they've got to meet all the relevant requirements. They've got to allocate land for need. And actually what we see are a lot of what I kind of deem protectionist neighbourhood plans. They protect areas of site, deeming a green gap or local green space, for example. They don't actually set out allocations to meet their need, which actually means that the protection they offer and the weight that can be given to them is decreased. So it's not a case that neighbourhood plan areas should just be no-go zones, in effect. Look at the greenbelt boundaries. Well, DLUC seems to be taking a much more active role in driving forward local plans. Again, I referenced Mole Valley. Again, they were one of the sort of, I suppose, most famous, for lack of a better phrase, local authorities looking to remove the greenbelt allocations they'd proposed. Well, actually, DLUC immediately intervened, or pretty sharpish intervened, said, no, you can't withdraw your local plan, you can't restart and look to remove those greenbelt sites. You've got to crack on as you are. So will we see that role expand? Yes, the removal of the 5-year housing land supply is, in our view, will have a negative impact on delivery. But actually, yes, while there is an element of local plans up to date and in play, the rollout of new style local plan is likely to be quite slow. Government are only envisaging about 50 a year, so are more opportunities going to crop up? And then with the 4-year housing land supply requirement transitional arrangements, they are only in play until December 2025, and that is a hard cutoff. So it is only a very bit of short-term disruption. So next slide, please, Celine. Brilliant, thank you. And I suppose it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, the title, but I thought, you've got all those short-term impacts, but actually the kind of overarching description or character of the time between when the NPPF was issued and today, and what we sort of think internally at Barra is uncertainty and confusion. And I think this is no better clarified than why I've deemed a short story about 4-year housing land supply. I've talked about the transitional arrangements. So you look at 19th of December, in the space of 3 months, 19th of December, the NPPF is issued, says no 5-year housing land supply requirement, but that only is in play for applications submitted after. It then introduces the 4-year housing land supply, but it's pretty clear that there's not a transition in that. It doesn't matter when the application was submitted. If the authority meets the criteria to designate 4-year housing land supply, then it can do so, regardless of when the application is submitted. Fine. We get to the 5th of February. Again, the housing supply PPG is updated, and it just reinforces what the NPPF has said. So far, so good. Not ideal, but we know where we are. But actually, we then get to an appeal, 4 days later in Chichester district for 150 homes by the promoter Gladman. And actually, what the inspector has done there is seem to have turned all that interpretation over the last couple of months on its head in paragraph 46 for anyone that's interested or already seen it. And he seems to apply the transitional arrangements to both the lack of 5-year housing land supply and the 4-year housing land supply. So although Chichester didn't have a 5-year housing land supply, they could demonstrate a 4-year housing land supply and above. But actually, the inspector has said, well, actually, that doesn't matter. The application was submitted before December. So that means that the 4-year housing land supply isn't in play. They've got to demonstrate 5 years, and proceeded on that basis, and the appeal was allowed. So actually, where do we go from there? It's just uncertainty and confusion. That kind of poor drafting, that lack of explicit guidance in the NPPF means did PINS get it wrong? Have they got it right? Is that appeal going to be JR? We just don't know at the minute. So again, it's uncertainty and confusion. So next slide. Brilliant, thank you. But the future is looking brighter. I've sort of focused on the negativities, but from an operational perspective, if the promised reforms materialise that Michael Gove talked about on 19th December, then the future is a bit brighter. I won't talk about everything on this slide. I'll just kind of pick up my top 3. First of which is the review into the role, remit and list of statutory consultees. They're probably the single biggest delayer of applications that we see and I see in Barrett. And actually a review of their role, their remit, looking at something more radical, like does a no response after 21 days deem it, effectively give it deemed consent? It gives that green light from that statutory consultee. For us, that is a really positive step in trying to drive out drive out those delays in the determination process. Looking at schemes of delegation, do we look at something, do like I've indicated, they're going to look at schemes of delegation and looking at prioritising committee time, which is fantastic. Are we going to see something more radical, like applications on sites that have been allocating the local plan, or reserve matters applications on sites that have got an allocation and an outline? Should they just be done through delegated powers? Should councils be forced to amend their schemes of delegation? We don't know, but again, that could be really positive. And then I think that the final bit is really looking at the use of PPAs as well. Local authorities, as Charlotte said, are in a financial crisis. PPAs are a great way to actually resource applications properly, get dedicated resource in, and looking at those to kind of regularise their usage and expectations is again a really, really positive move. So last slide, and then I will hand over. I've tried to look at this last time in terms of, okay, well, all that uncertainty, all that confusion, all those negative implications out of the NPPF. Okay, well, how can the industry adapt this? And again, I won't talk about everything, but you've got to look over that kind of green belt hump, is our view. A good site will always be a good site. We can't get away from allocating and consenting schemes in the most sustainable areas of the UK, which more often than not are surrounded by greenbelt in a lot of major areas. So we've got to take that into account. My personal opinion, not a Barra view, but personal opinion is this, the focus on not bringing forward greenbelt sites probably won't last. And I think we're going to have to see these sustainable sites keep coming forward. Keep in mind those transitional arrangements are limited. Like I said, for the 4-year housing land supply, that December 2025, our understanding is that is a hard stop. So even if a local authority brought out a local plan or issued application of Regulation 18 local plan in November 2025, they would only benefit for a month. They don't get 2 years worth of transitional arrangements after that. So bear that in mind in terms of planning application strategies. And then lastly, it's the middle bottom box. We are in a system where appeals and case law reigns supreme. You've only got to look at Hillside and Dennis. You've only got to look at the recent High Court decision in terms of the sequential test for flooding. Whenever you're bringing forward a site, or whenever a local authority, for example, is assessing and determining a scheme, you cannot ignore appeals and more fundamentally cannot ignore case law, because that is just turning things on its head, and pretty long-standing understandings of the sequential test, for example, are currently being flipped on their head, and that can't be ignored. So hopefully that was useful, and I will hand back.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Chris. Now we've got a bit of time for questions, so please continue to fire away and send those through. Well, we've got a few already, but before we turn to those, I'd just like to kick us off by asking the panel to turn their sights towards the election. So it's going to happen sometime before January. We don't know exactly when, but can I ask how much a change of government might impact planning policy going forward? Are we expecting a significant overhaul of what we've just been describing anytime soon if there is a change of government? Pamela, do you want to start off?
So it might not come as a surprise. You can probably tell from the accent. I'm from Liverpool, so a change in central government would actually align itself a lot neater with what Liverpool is already quite used to working with. So we have a devolved local combined authority, and that is definitely something that central government has been putting a push towards. So in particular, we've been looking at the Freeport developments and the ancillary use of funds that will be used to support that. But what's been really interesting is that actually using that devolved power, our mayors have been front loading what the central government has suggested would be part of levelling up. So even though they've been calling it levelling up, the only places where there genuinely seems to have been any sort of impetus or real investment has been in these combined authority areas, and predominantly with Labour-based mayors, particularly in the Northwest, as I say, and you can tell I am quite nepotistic to that point. But I think if Labour, or when Labour get in, I probably shouldn't say that, but if there is a change of government, I can only see that being strengthened. So that'll be really interesting to see.
Charlotte, you spoke a bit about the implications of the NPPF for the Green Belt. That's a topic that the Labour Party has hinted it's keen to look at. Do you think we're likely to see substantial changes to Green Belt policy if Labour enters government? And have you been impressed so far by what they've been talking about around that?
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, I think, in terms of the Green Belt, it's quite hard to say. I know that they have been pushing quite strongly in terms of narrative and rhetoric on what they're willing to do in terms of looking at that more comprehensively and more qualitatively as well, in terms of the quality of land, what it's currently being used for, where there is room to change and where there is definitely sort of the proviso to keep the Greenbelt preserved as it is at the minute. In practice, however, I think that they are aware that they will be borrowing, in some cases, some voters from some quite heavily Tory areas, areas which are, traditionally quite close to Greenbelt land. And I think that they will, in practice, be quite aware of the fact that there is a sort of quite diverse voter base that they are going to need to keep on side if they're looking to a more sort of long-term, post 5-year electoral strategy. Having said that, though, they have been going quite hard on the fact that they're the party of the builders, not the blockers, really responding to that kind of conservative push on the 1 million homes by the end of this parliament narrative. I know there's moves talking about creating a raft of new towns. There's moves about creating a planning passport to fast track brownfield development as well as Greenbelt. And I know there's also talk about sort of more severe crackdowns on developers who are choosing to wriggle out of affordable housing obligations. So I can really see the Labour Party playing to sort of both camps here in the run-up to the election, which is only sensible, you would think, from a policy position. But I think in practice, I will be surprised if the reality is quite as strong as some of the rhetoric.
Okay. Obviously, the Shadow Chancellor delivered a major speech to business leaders yesterday, in which planning policy was one of the sort of three core economic missions that are going to underpin their sort of strategy for growth. Chris, maybe you could tell us a bit about how credible Labour Party policy on house building is viewed within the industry. We had some polling not that long ago that said 7 out of 10 house builders were sort of considering voting or supporting Labour. Do you think that sort of captures the mood? What's the view?
I think it does. I think the people that we speak to in the industry, I think, do seem to be rallying around what Labour have said. the kind of previous couple of years and kind of characterised by the issue of the new NPPF has been not necessarily overtly, but anti-development. Essentially, it's made development a lot more difficult to bring forward. And actually, what Labour are saying, a lot of what Charlotte has said in terms of looking at Greenbelt, looking at Greybelt, looking at do they look at new towns, looking at introducing some form of kind of light touch regional planning, a national spatial strategy. All of that is really incredible stuff that can kind of just drive such better outcomes. And I think that's what the industry is rallying around. So I think there is a lot of confidence, and I think there is a lot of credibility viewed behind what Labour is saying, because they have engaged with the development industry. They've asked for our views, as in the same way that the Department for Levelling Up, we meet government regularly. They asked us for our views. Labour have asked for that as well, not just Barratt, but other house builders, and that has actually informed what they've said. They've taken what we've told us and what we've told them and turned that into a potentially implementable policy. So I think there is a lot of positive mood music around the industry at the minute in terms of what Labour are saying.
When the NPPF first came out, I got the impression in terms of the response from the industry that there was a feeling that the government had sort of run out of steam in terms of political willingness to tackle these issues on housing. Do you think, seeing the policy sort of implemented, has there been any change in view on the NPPF? Is it viewed slightly more positively now, or is it still a bit negative on that?
I think when the move on the NPPF from what was issued for consultation in December 22 to what was then brought out in December 2023 did actually see an improvement. I think the whatever it was, mid-20,000s or so responses that they got, I think the overwhelming majority of which were quite negative towards a lot of certain elements, and actually those, I don't want to say more contentious, but I think the really bad elements were stripped out of that. So actually we were left with ultimately how we still viewed negative, but a slightly better document than was issued for consultation. So that's one thing, but you're quite right. It's kind of characterised by, that change to the NPPF wouldn't actually have come out if the current government maybe weren't so beholden to a certain group of MPs in certain authorities. And I think that there is that feeling that it has kind of just run out of steam a little bit. They're trying to hang on potentially, and actually that's driven some decision making that might not be the most positive.
We've got a question from Neil Brown, who says, what are the impacts of cuts to local authorities on delivering through the planning system? Charlotte, you spoke a little bit about the need for more support for the planning system. Obviously, both parties have made a bit of noise about the need to fund more planning officials, but that comes against this backdrop of a sort of long-term drop in funding for local authorities during the austerity decade. So what is this sort of, how far off are we in terms of appropriate levels of resourcing, and how convinced are you by the rhetoric from the main party?
Thanks for that. Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And the way that we view it, there's sort of the issues around skills, but also capacity. We view it as a sort of very much a twofold issue. So lack of capacity in local planning authorities on its own really does lead to a number of delays in bringing forward development, and also the quality of the development when that does come forward. So we carried out some research in April of last year with our member architects, and that research showed that 22% of practices surveyed reported projects being abandoned in the last 3 months, compared to 7% the year before, due to delays in the processing of planning applications. So that's obviously having a knock-on impact across the board, not just for developers, but for architects, other built environment professionals too. And 47% of practices surveyed reported some projects being delayed by 6 months or more, compared to 30% in 2021. So that's a 17% jump in 2 years. So in terms of capacity and delays with development coming through the system, that's clearly a massive issue. But there's also the issue of skills, which is much harder to quantify in terms of resource needed than just sort of boots on the ground, right? So many planning departments we know don't have access to qualified design expertise. So that could be architects, urban designers, and other built environment professionals with that sort of design background, which can lead to a decrease in the quality of development and can also cause delays down the line when there are questions around details of the planning applications when it gets to scrutiny stage. So we know that that's a real issue that could be avoided by having that expertise from the beginning. So obviously, as you touched upon, there has been some movement from government to remediate this. There was the Planning Skills Delivery Fund announced in July 2023, also the Super Squad of planners announced at the same time. And while these measures are really welcome, and we know it's nowhere near the sort of level of financial resource needed, it's really hard to put an actual figure on the resource that is needed because it's so dependent LPA to LPA on what sort of, whether it's a skills issue, a capacity issue, whether there are other delays in the system. But we're working alongside colleagues in the sector, including the Royal Town Planning Institute, to try and get a bit of a better idea of that. In terms of the question you asked at the end, Daniel, about Labour's plans on this, I think they're aware of the issue. I think the government are as well. I was at a conference yesterday where Housing Minister Lee Rowley spoke about the need for more capacity. So I think it very much is a salient and live issue for both government and the opposition. We're just keen to see some funding sit behind that now.
Pamela, on the issue of nutrient neutrality, that's been a sort of battleground between the two parties, but it also seems to be within both of the two parties a bit of a battleground between those responsible for the environment and those responsible for housing. You know, DEFRA and DLUC sort of stepping on each other's toes, and then in the Labour camp there's been a bit of mixed signals in terms of voting against reforming nutrient neutrality on the one hand, but then talking about being the party for the builders, not the blockers, on the other. Is there a way to sort of square the circle on this topic, and do you see that issue being resolved anytime soon?
I think, to be fair, it's going to sound like a bit of a lawyer's answer, but to be fair, I think it is starting to work its way through now. I think that there is an acceptance that there is a problem. So rather than the sort of polluter pays principle where we're always looking for the person who caused it initially, I think there's a general acceptance now between both sides that the issue is there. And it's not going to be resolved unless everybody works together. So, as you say, we've seen it predominantly down south at the moment. And yes, it was seen as a bit of a blocker because a letter went out to most of the local authorities that were affected by neutrality issues saying you cannot grant planning permission for housing unless and until we get to the bottom of how this was started, what we need to do, and what we can tolerate in terms of allowing further development to come forward. Now, most of those letters have either now been overridden or the local authorities themselves have actually put the money up front to resolve those issues and get the data for themselves. So thankfully, a lot more of those schemes are coming forward, but they are starting to mitigate and design in solutions around this neutrality issue, which is exactly what needed to be done at the start. So I think they've had a knee-jerk reaction, just put a blocker to everything, and that's when that sort of suggestion of them blocking it happened. But we can see sort of comparisons with, open water swimmers at the moment and water pollution more generally. If you don't block it, then the situation just gets worse, and it seems to get worse at an extortionate rate. So in hindsight, it's always better in hindsight, isn't it? It seems like it was such a knee-jerk and absolute reaction, but actually in a relatively short time, if we think of planning change and case laws and things like that come forward, they've actually managed to come through for some sort of solution, and it does seem to be actually working now.
Okay. We've got a question from Lola Adiokan, who asks, how does the issue of void properties, especially council-owned, factor into the strategy to increase and meet housing need? I think that was asked while Charlotte was speaking, but Charlotte or Chris, you're welcome.
I think I'll have a go, but I must admit it's probably not quite my bag to answer this. But I think there's got to be a more comprehensive strategy towards, I'm guessing by void properties, it's obviously empty properties. There's got to be a more comprehensive strategy towards bringing those forward, because it's you can absolutely rely on new home delivery to come forward. There will always be new homes delivered, but there are a lot of homes, and the kind of what is termed the retrofit challenge, say in terms of energy efficiency, should fully be extended to those empty properties. And actually, who are the responsible actors, who are the responsible parties to bring forward those properties? Should that form part of a local plan housing supply, for example? Should there be some sort of funding or a body set up to help identify and deliver those as additional dwellings in local plans? That very much seems to be a missing element at the minute, and it just seems to be a whose responsibility is that? No one knows.
Yeah, I can come in on that slightly as well. It's not something that we at REBA have looked at in a great amount of detail since I joined 18 months ago, but I have done some previous work on empty properties, so I can speak with a slightly more personal hat on. I think, as Chris mentioned, a lot of it is a responsibility issue, looking at sort of who is responsible for bringing those back into quite often a state where they are livable again. A lot of properties that are sort of void for a number of years are not in a state where, as you said, the energy efficiency measures are up to scratch, where the quality of the house is actually sort of fit for human habitation quite a lot of the time, and that obviously has an expense attached to it. Something that I also really sort of found in a previous role of mine, which was sort of tangential to a local authority, is the way that sort of powers such as compulsory purchase orders can be enacted to bring these properties back into use is not only quite difficult to enact in practice, but also sort of quite different from area to area, depending on like the structure of the authority, the people that they're dealing with, and also, to go back to the point I made before, the capacity and skills that that authority has to enter into negotiations with property owners if those void properties were, for example, former right to buy properties, or whether they still are in local authority or housing association ownership. So I think it's a question about sort of like whose responsibility is it, where does the funding come from, and who's going to pick up the baton to make that part of the overall housing strategy. But I do agree that it is a very important part of it, as well as building new developments.
Great, thanks both. I've got just one more question for Chris, and then we'll move towards a close. But Chris, the CMA recently released the findings of a market study into house building. Was there anything in there that sort of pertained to planning policy, and do you think that it's likely that any recommendations set forth there will be implemented by this government or the next?
Mm-hmm. So first part of the question first, I think the CMA report is an incredibly interesting topic, because when it was announced, when Michael Gove essentially pushed for it, there was an explicit point made that the planning system should not be in the scope of that study. So we all went into it, and when the CMA, they've got the ability to come in and ask everybody relevant to that investigation to ask them questions. We're forced to answer it. They can request internal documents to ensure that we're kind of evidencing what we're saying. And actually, the outcome of that report is not just that the planning system is a factor; it is the central factor to why the housing market has underperformed. So that in itself is a massive win, I think, for our industry. So you look at it identified the plan system, the persistent underdelivery, the complexity, the cost that's involved in bringing applications forward, how that's exclusionary to SMEs. Looking at, from my large developer hat on, land banking doesn't happen, or in terms of it's not an intentional bad action, it's a rational response, I think was the CMA phrase, to the planning system. You've got to have a land bank of sites that you can draw down to make sure your delivery is uninterrupted. And they're the findings, and it came up with a lot of really good recommendations as well, looking at some of the things I've said today: schemes of delegation, review of statutory consultees, ring fencing of planning fees. That's a massive one that, I don't know if that was kind of just put on the too difficult pile when the fee regulations were changed in December last year. Despite 88%, I think it was, respondents saying you should ring fence planning fees, they then weren't ring fenced, because I think there's an issue with kind of primary legislation. But that would be such a massive help to local planning authorities. So I identified some really, in our view, implementable, but fundamental, but implementable actions. So that's massive, and we've kind of really thrown our weight behind those in pushing for them. But the second part of your question, in terms of will we see those recommendations come in the current government term? Being honest, I don't think so. I think that's going to be too difficult. I think there will be other priorities. You've just brought a new NPPF out that makes housing targets advisory. One of the CMA recommendations was basically make housing targets mandatory again. You're not going to see a flip. You're not going to see these kind of fundamental changes in the space of 7-8 months if there's going to be an election in the autumn. So I think for the time being, it's very much going to, disappointingly, I think, sit on a shelf for a while. I may be wrong, but I think what we will see, post-election, whoever is in post, I think will definitely re-pick that up. Because again, a lot of what they've said, Labour have picked up on as well. And I think if the Conservatives do get back in, they will want to, come in strong, perhaps reinvigorate the system. And you've got an external report there, probably the most robust report for, at least in probably my lifetime or my career, saying this is what you need to do to deliver more houses.
Great, thanks, Chris. We're approaching the end of the session now, so let's do one last quick fire round for the panelists. What one change would each of you like to see made to planning policy by the next government, whether that's Conservative or Labour? Should we do it in the same order we spoke at the beginning? So Pamela, Charlotte, and Chris.
I can keep it really short and very controversial and say genuine levelling up.
I think one change is very, very hard, but speaking as a representative of architects and architecture, I think something that we're very keen to see baked in a much more holistic and substantive way is equality throughout the design process and throughout sort of sustainability measures, accessibility measures, etc.
My one will be bring back mandatory housing targets and enforce them through light touch regional plans that set a housing target for the region, set the economic and infrastructure priorities, and make sure the local plans in that region deliver them.
Perfect, thanks everyone. Pamela, could I just ask you, what do you think real levelling up would look like in terms of policy? We've got 1 minute.
You're really asking me to go down this rabbit hole now, aren't you? This is all recorded. Basically, it's everything that's on LinkedIn where everybody's laughing at the levelling up promotions that they're sending out now and the advertisements about genuine levelling up. The money has not been spent up here. The money is being spent by the local authorities and front-footing on the back of promises from central government. So central government needs to come true on their promises to redivert HS2 spend, for example. It needs to start up here with the levelling up, not start from down south up.
Perfect. As a fellow Northerner, I think that's a nice place to end on. Yeah, so that's about all we've got time for. Thank you everyone for joining. I hope you've all found it as informative as I have. Once again, you'll be able to get the session on demand via the same link if you want to watch it again. It should be available from about an hour after we finish. Once we're done, you should see a little survey come up, and if you can fill this in, that would be much appreciated. It should only take about 30 seconds, but it helps us a lot. We've got one more Risk and Regs webinar today, starting in half an hour, and that's going to be looking at managing and delivering Part L regulations, and that's going to be chaired by our editorial director, Chloe McCulloch. So hopefully some of you can join us for that. Thank you again for watching, and have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you.